There are some doors a young woman is not supposed to walk through alone. The door at the back of the Richmond House ballroom, the tall glass one that gave onto the dark gardens, was one of them. And on the warm spring night our story begins. Lady Eleanor Beaumont walked through it anyway, quickly, without looking back, the way a person walks when staying one more moment in a room would cost them something they could not afford to lose. She did not walk. If we are to be honest with one another, and we are going to be honest with one another all the way through this story, Lady Eleanor Beaumont fled. Behind her, the great ballroom of the Duke and Duchess of Richmond blazed with 2,000 candles and the massed jewels of half the peerage of England. Before her lay the cool dark of the garden, the gravel pale under a thin moon, the hedges rising black and silent. She did not care where the path led. She cared only that the path led away, away from the hot crush of silk and perfume, away from the music, and most particularly away from a gentleman named Mr. Pelham, who had spent the last 40 minutes describing to her, in exhaustive and loving detail, the drainage improvements he had lately made to his estate in Lincolnshire. So she went fast down the dark path, with her chin up and her breath coming quick, and she was not looking where she was going, and that single fact is where everything in this long story truly begins. Because Lady Eleanor Beaumont, moving at speed through a garden she did not know, walked directly and with considerable force into a man. It was not a gentle collision. He was tall and solid and entirely unexpected, and she struck him the way one strikes a closed door in the dark, with a small, undignified sound and a stagger that would have put her down on the gravel had a hand not closed hard around her arm and held her up. For a moment they simply stood there, the two of them, in the dark, far too close, his hand gripping her arm and her own hand flat against a broad chest in a plain dark coat, both of them breathing, neither of them yet aware that the entire course of their lives had just changed. The man was dressed in black, no silk waistcoat shot with silver, no orders pinned to his breast, no jewelled fob, no decoration of any kind. Plain, dark, severe clothing, the clothing of a man who did not wish to be looked at. And Lady Eleanor Beaumont, flustered and embarrassed, and still half inside the panic that had driven her out of doors, looked at the plain, dark clothing in the dim light, and arrived, instantly and with total confidence, at the wrong conclusion. She decided he was a servant. "You may release my arm," she said. Her voice came out sharper than she meant it, because fright so often dresses itself up as temper. "At once, if you please. And, really, you ought not to be lurking about in the dark, startling people. Whatever can you be thinking, standing here like that? Like some sort of brooding statue someone has forgotten to bring indoors." The hand let go of her arm, and the man said nothing at all. He simply looked at her. Even in that poor light she could feel him looking at her, with a stillness so complete it was almost insolent. And she, flustered, and now embarrassed about being flustered, which is the very worst, kind of embarrassed, made the thing worse. "Well," she said, "have you nothing to say for yourself? You have nearly knocked me to the ground. The least you can do is be useful. Go inside, find a footman, and have a glass of lemonade brought out to the stone bench yonder. And do try to move with a little more haste than you have shown in the way of conversation." There was a silence, and then, out of the dark, in a voice that was low and unhurried, and dry as the turning of an old book's page, the man spoke at last. "I regret," he said, "that I am unlikely to be of much use to you in the matter of lemonade. But pray do not let that trouble you. I am quite accustomed to disappointing people's expectations. It is, I am told, the one thing I do reliably well. Now I am going to stop, just here, with the two of them facing each other in the dark. The lady who has just ordered a duke to fetch her a cool drink, and the duke who has not yet seen fit to tell her what she has done." Because before I take you one step further into this story, there is something I must ask of you, wherever you are in the world tonight. And I do hope you'll tell me, down in the comments, whether it's a quiet kitchen, or a long road, or a dark bedroom with the whole house asleep around you. I want you to settle in properly, because this is not a tale for one sitting. This is a story told in parts, the way the great stories always were, around a fire, a little at a time, with the listeners leaning in. And so, if you would like to hear the whole of it, you must come and sit by my fire on purpose. Subscribe to Jane Tells Stories, and the next part of this tale will find its way to you the moment it is ready. Think of it as a small promise between the two of us, and if you do not subscribe, well, then you shall simply owe me a favor, and I am a woman who remembers her favors. Now, come back with me to the
I
very start of
must
that
get
evening,
out of
and a
here.
house where the candles were counted, and a family with one last hope. To understand why Lady Eleanor
This air is
Beaumont fled a
stifling.
ballroom, you must first understand the house she had come from, and the weight she had carried out the door of it. It was a tall, narrow house on an unfashionable street, rented rather than owned, and 3 years before it had been a very different sort of house, in a very different sort of street. The Beaumonts had not always counted candles. Eleanor, Ellie, to the 2 or 3 people in the world permitted to love her, was the second daughter of the late Viscount Beaumont, and for the first 19 years of her life she had lived the comfortable, unexamined life of a viscount's daughter, with a fine house and a season in its proper time, and not the smallest notion that the floor she stood upon was anything but solid stone. It was not stone, it was a card table, and card tables, as this story will have a great deal to say about before we are through, are the least solid floor in all of England. The late Viscount Beaumont had been a charming man. Everyone said so, and they said it in the particular way people say a thing when they mean it, as both a compliment and a warning. He was charming, and he was warm, and he loved his daughters, and he could not, for the life of him, and in the end it was very nearly for the life of him, leave a green baize table alone. It began, as it always begins, as nothing, a few guineas among friends, and it grew the way these things grow, in the dark, quietly, behind a smiling face, until the night 3 years ago when the Viscount came home, grey and silent, and shut the library door, and a great deal of shouting that the servants pretended not to hear went on behind it, and nothing in the Beaumont family was ever solid again. He did not live a year after that night. His heart, the physicians said, though Ellie had her own private opinion that it was less his heart than his shame, and that the two organs are more closely connected than physicians like to admit. He died, and he left behind him 3 things. He left a widow, he left 2 unmarried daughters, and he left a mountain of debt so high that when the lawyers had finished their grim arithmetic, there was found to be, quite simply, nothing left at all. The title and the entailed estate. The house Ellie had been a child in, the long gallery, the orchard, passed, as such things must, to a distant cousin, a stranger, a man the girls had met, perhaps, twice, who took possession with brisk and faintly embarrassed efficiency and did not invite them to stay. Everything that was not nailed down by the entail was sold to satisfy the creditors, and the 3 women of the house Beaumont, the Viscountess, and Ellie and her younger sister Margaret, came down in the world the way a stone comes down a hillside, quickly, loudly, and with no possibility of going back up. Now, the Viscountess Beaumont was not a strong woman, and the fall did not make her stronger. She had been bred for ease, and ease had been taken from her, and something in her had simply folded quietly inward and declined to unfold again. By the time our story begins, she kept much to her room, pale and fretful and easily tired, her health a delicate and expensive thing that the household could only just afford to maintain. The doctor came twice a month. The doctor was not cheap. And so, and here is the heart of it, Here is the weight Ellie carried. The running of that narrow rented house, the management of its anxious servants and its frightening accounts, the soothing of its invalid, and the steering of its future, all of it had come to rest on the shoulders of a young woman of 22 who had been raised to do embroidery. She had not done embroidery. That is the thing I most want you to know about Ellie Beaumont before she walks back into that ballroom. The world had handed her a disaster and expected her to weep prettily over it, and instead she had rolled up the sleeves of her made-over gowns and gone to work. She learned the accounts. She learned which creditors could be soothed and which must be paid. She learned to turn a collar and trim a bonnet so that last year's looked, in a kind light, very nearly like this year's. She did it all without complaint and without fuss, and she did it, mostly, without anyone thanking her, because the people we depend upon are so very often the people we forget to thank. She was not what the age called a beauty. I will be honest with you, because she would want me to be. She was slight and quick, and there was a scatter of freckles across her nose that no amount of her mother's lemon water had ever persuaded to fade. And she had a habit, when she was thinking hard, of catching her lower lip between her teeth. But she had a pair of wide, clear, hazel eyes that seemed to see straight through to the back of whatever they looked at. And she had a way of holding her head. And when Lady Eleanor Beaumont smiled, a real smile, not the small social one she kept for strangers, something happened in a room that no merely beautiful face has ever quite managed. People turned. They did not always know why. And she had one more thing, a secret thing, and I will tell it to you now, because you are going to need it. Late at night, when the accounts were balanced and her mother was settled and the house was finally quiet, Ellie Beaumont lit a single candle in her cold little room, and she read history, philosophy, and above all, French poetry, which she did not merely read but translated, slowly and lovingly, line by careful line, filling a plain notebook with English words, chosen to carry the weight of French ones. It was the one thing she did entirely for herself. It was the one room in her life that the disaster had not been allowed to enter. In an age that had decided a clever woman was a faintly embarrassing thing, like a dog that could do sums. Lady Eleanor Beaumont was a blue-stocking in secret, and she guarded the secret the way you guard the last warm coal of a fire you cannot afford to relight. That was the house. A faded mother, a clever hidden daughter, and a third Beaumont I have not yet given you. And her you will meet at the ball, because Margaret would never forgive me for introducing her anywhere as dull as a chapter about debt. For there was, of course, one path out. There is always one path in stories of this age, and it is always the same narrow path, and it leads through a church door. The house of Beaumont could be saved. The mother kept comfortable, the doctor paid, the younger sister given a future, by precisely one thing: a marriage, a good marriage, an advantageous match, to a man of fortune, made by one of the Viscount's daughters, before the family's last small reserve of money and respectability ran out, as it was very visibly running out, like sand from a cracked glass. Everyone in that narrow house knew it. No one said it aloud. And on the night of the Richmond ball, when Ellie stood before her glass in her best gown, which was 3 seasons old and had been turned, and trimmed afresh with ribbon she had dyed herself, she looked at her own clear hazel eyes in the candlelight, and she understood, without anyone needing to be so vulgar as to tell her, that she was being sent to that ball not to dance. She was being sent to be sold, kindly, politely, for the best possible price, to save the people she loved. And Ellie Beaumont, who was brave and clever and 22, lifted her chin at her own reflection and went down the stairs to do it. If you have never seen a great London ball of that age at the very height of its glory, then I must try to build one for you, because Ellie walked into the middle of it, and you must walk in beside her. Imagine first the light. Richmond House blazed. Every window poured gold into the street, and within, the ballroom was a single, vast shimmer of candle flame, thrown back and back again from 100 tall mirrors, so that the room seemed to have no walls at all, only an endless glittering depth. Imagine the heat of it, the close warm press of too many bodies in too much silk. Imagine the sound. The orchestra soaring away bravely above it all, and beneath the music the great roar of the ton at play. 600 of the most important people in England all talking at once, and every one of them, you may be sure, talking about somebody else. For that is the thing you must understand about the world Ellie was stepping into. It was beautiful, and it was brilliant, and it ran, underneath, on a single fuel, and the fuel was watching. Everyone watched everyone. Every gown was priced, every partner was noted, every young woman standing rose or fell by half an inch with each dance she was or was not asked to join. The Tun was a court without a king, and its law was gossip, and its punishment was to be quietly, smilingly, completely left out. Into this Ellie came, on the night our story begins, with her mother too unwell to attend, and her aunt, a vague and well-meaning chaperone borrowed for the occasion, already drifting toward the card, room. And at Ellie's side, blazing with an excitement she made not the slightest effort to hide, came the third and last of the Beaumonts. Margaret Beaumont was 19, and where the misfortune had made her elder sister quiet and watchful, it had simply failed, so far, to make any impression on Margaret at all. She was golden-haired and blue-eyed and quick to laugh, pretty in the bright, immediate way that a room notices at once. And she loved a ball with her whole uncomplicated heart. She loved the music and the candles and the dancing and the sheer delicious drama of it. And if I tell you that Margaret, also on occasion, looked at her clever elder sister with a small, hot flicker of something that was not quite jealousy, but was certainly its near neighbour, looked at the way people's eyes caught and held on Ellie's quiet face, and wondered why hers, which was by every honest measure the prettier, did not hold them the same way. If I tell you that, I do not tell it to make you think less of Margaret. I tell it because it is true, and because sisters are complicated, and because that small flicker is going to matter later, and I never hide a thing from you that matters later. Ellie, Margaret breathed, her gloved hand tight on her sister's arm. Ellie, only look. Have you ever in your life seen anything so glorious? I have not, said Ellie honestly. And for one moment, she let herself simply feel it, the light and the music, before the cold practical clock in her own chest began once more to tick. She had perhaps 3 hours. 3 hours in this glittering and pitiless room to begin the work of saving her family. And she had no illusions about the size of the task, because Lady Eleanor Beaumont, dowerless, was bringing to the marriage market the one commodity that market valued least. A clever woman with no money and a famous father's debts trailing behind her like a torn hem. It was at this point, and I want you to mark this, because the villain of a story should always be met early, while he is still being charming, that a gentleman appeared at her elbow as if the crowd had simply produced him. Lady Eleanor, he bowed. He bowed beautifully. I had begun to fear London would be denied you this season. The season, I find, is so much greyer for the want of conversation worth the having. His name was Viscount Harrington, and he was, on the surface of him, everything the surface of that world admired. He was perhaps 34 and handsome in a smooth, finished, expensive way, his dark hair touched with a distinguished silver at the temples, his coat a flawless midnight blue, his manner an unbroken sheet of polished ice over still water. He was wealthy, he was titled, he was, by every measure the Tun kept its accounts in, a catch. And Ellie, looking up into his face and making her small social smile, felt, and could not for her life have told you why. A single cold thread of unease pulled tight somewhere beneath her ribs. It was nothing she could have named. He said all the correct things. He paid her the correct compliments. But his eyes, while his mouth was being charming, were doing something his mouth was not. His eyes were taking an inventory. They moved over the turned seams of her gown, the dyed ribbon, the absence of any jewel at her throat, and Ellie understood, with the swift, unhappy clarity of a clever woman, that Viscount Harrington was not looking at her. He was reading her accounts. He had heard, as all of London had heard, that the Beaumont girls must marry or sink, and far from being repelled by her need, as the other gentlemen of that room were repelled by it, Viscount Harrington appeared, in some cool and unsettling way, to find her need the most interesting thing about her. A desperate woman, you see, is a woman with no power to refuse, and there are certain men who find that fact not a deterrent, but an attraction. She danced with him, because one cannot refuse a viscount without a reason, and a feeling beneath one's ribs is not a reason any drawing-room in England would accept. She danced with him, and she was clever, and she gave him polished words back for his polished words, and all the while the unease pulled tighter. And when the dance released her, she made her escape to the side of the one person in all that glittering room who was truly her own. Miss Charlotte Langley had been Ellie's dearest friend since they were children, and she was, in her quiet way, quite as clever as Ellie herself, and a great deal less inclined to be charitable about it. She was a calm, dark-eyed, watchful young woman, and she stood now against the wall, surveying the ballroom with the faint, detached amusement of a naturalist, observing the courtship habits of some particularly silly bird. "You looked," Charlotte observed as Ellie reached her, "exactly as you looked at 9 years old when you were made to eat the boiled parsnip. Composed, dutiful, and entirely unconvinced." "Charlotte," Ellie let out a long breath, "what do you know of Viscount Harrington?" "I know he is rich." Charlotte's eyes had narrowed slightly, following the man's blue coat through the crowd. "I know he is received everywhere, and I know that I have watched 3 separate matrons this season steer their daughters away from him with smiles on their faces, and that not one of them would tell me why." She turned her dark gaze on her friend. "Which is precisely the sort of thing, Ellie, that a sensible woman files away and does not forget." It was not comfortable comfort, but it was honest, and Ellie had long ago learned that honest discomfort was worth a great deal more than the other kind. She might have stood there safe at Charlotte's side for the rest of the evening. And how different this story would then have been, had not Mr. Pelham of the Lincolnshire drainage chosen that exact moment to discover her, and bow and claim, with the serene confidence of a dull man, the next 2 dances and the supper between them. 2 dances and a supper with the drainage. Ellie endured the dances. She was good at enduring. The last 3 years had made her an expert in it, but somewhere in the middle of Mr. Pelham's account of his new culverts, with the heat and the noise and the weight of the whole impossible evening pressing down on her like a hand, something in Ellie Beaumont's chest simply said, quietly and firmly, "Not the supper, not the culverts, not for 1 more minute." And so she murmured something. The heat, a little air, she would return directly, and she slipped from Mr. Pelham's side, and she crossed the great blazing room, and she walked through the tall glass door at the back of it that a young woman was not supposed to walk through alone. You know what waited for her in the dark. You have been there already, but you do not yet know the man she walked into. And to know him, we must leave Ellie a moment in the garden and go back an hour to a closed carriage and a furious old woman and the most reluctant guest at the whole of the Richmond ball. An hour before, Lady Eleanor Beaumont fled into the garden. A black travelling carriage, with no crest upon its door, had stood in the long line of vehicles outside Richmond House, and inside that carriage a battle was being fought. It was a quiet battle. The most serious battles in that world were always quiet, but it was a battle nonetheless, and it was being fought between the two last living members of one of the oldest and most powerful families in England. On one seat sat the Dowager Duchess of Ravenswood. She was past 70, and she sat as straight as a girl, and she had buried a husband and a son and a great many lesser enemies, and she had not the smallest intention of being buried herself until one particular piece of family business was concluded to her satisfaction. Her hair was silver white beneath a cap of fine old lace. Her eyes were a sharp, pale raptor's grey, and her hands were folded on the silver head of an ebony cane that she used, as far as Ellie's world could ever determine, far more often as a sceptre than as a support. On the opposite seat sat her grandson, and her grandson did not want to be there. "You will go in," said the Dowager Duchess. "You will stand where you can be seen. You will dance twice, and you will be civil. I am not, I think, asking a great deal. Lesser men have survived an evening of it." "Lesser men," said her grandson, "are not stared at. You are a duke, Alexander. You will be stared at in your coffin. You may as well grow accustomed to it, standing up." This was Alexander. Alexander, the 5th Duke of Ravenswood. And if the name went through that ballroom like a struck bell whenever it was spoken, there was good reason, and I must give you the reason now. He was 29, and he was, by the plain accounting of rank and land and fortune, very nearly the most powerful unmarried man in the kingdom. But it was not the dukedom that made the room turn when he entered it. It was the other thing, for Alexander of Ravenswood had not spent the last years idle in his great houses, as a duke was entitled to do. He had bought a commission, and he had gone to the war, and he had stood in the smoke and the screaming of the worst day that age would ever know. He had been at Waterloo, and he had come home from it a hero, with his name in the dispatches and a long pale scar laid clean along the left side of his jaw. He would not hide the scar. The dowager had, in the early days, suggested with great delicacy that his whiskers might be allowed to grow in a manner that would. And Alexander had looked at her, just once, in a particular way, and the subject had never been raised again. He wore the scar the way another man might wear a medal, except that he wore no medals either. On this night, as on every night, the Duke of Ravenswood was dressed in plain, severe, unrelieved black, with no order, no jewel, no decoration of any kind. A man, you would have said, looking at him, who had decided that since he could not prevent the world from staring, he would at least give it as little as possible to admire. The county called him cold. The drawing-rooms called him proud. The bolder gossips, in the safety of a whisper, called him heartless, and they had a tale to hang the word on. They said the Duke of Ravenswood was come to London this season, for one purpose and one purpose only: to choose a wife, not to love a wife, to choose one, the way a man chooses a horse, by her lines and her breeding and her temper, a perfect, quiet, decorative, biddable duchess, who would give him an heir and a spare, and never, ever, trouble the still grey surface of his life, with a single demand of her own. That was the marriage the ton expected of him. That was the marriage his grandmother had dragged him to the Richmond ball to begin. And here is what the ton did not know, and what I will tell you, because a storyteller who keeps the truth of her hero from you is not worth the firelight. Alexander of Ravenswood was not cold. He was something that cold can be mistaken for, by people who have never had to learn the difference. He was a man holding himself very, very still, because he had learned, in the smoke of that terrible day, that a man who held still could keep certain things shut in their box, and a man who did not hold still could not. He did not sleep well. He did not sleep often at all. There was a young officer, a boy, really, a laughing boy of 19, who had served under him and trusted him, whom Alexander had not been able to reach in time, whom Alexander had watched fall, and That boy came to him in the nights, and the only defence the Duke of Ravenswood had ever found against him was stillness. Silence. The plain black coat, the shut door, the cold the world saw and feared and called him, underneath it. And there were perhaps two people living who knew this. There was a dry, quick, unexpected humour, and a loyalty that would have walked into fire, and a heart that had simply been packed carefully away in the dark, like the good china, against a day that might be safe enough to bring it out. He did not expect that day. He had no notion at all, sitting in that dark carriage being scolded by his grandmother, that the day was perhaps 40 minutes off, and that it would announce itself by walking into him at speed in a garden and ordering him to fetch a glass of lemonade. He went in the end. One does not, in the long run, defeat the Dowager Duchess of Ravenswood. He went in, and he stood where he could be seen, and he was stared at exactly as predicted. 600 faces turning, and then pretending they had not turned. He danced once, with a young lady selected by his grandmother, a faultless and terrified creature who answered everything he said with "Yes, Your Grace," and "Indeed, Your Grace," until Alexander felt the old familiar dryness closing over him like water. And then, between one dance and the next, with his grandmother's eye elsewhere, and a friend's careless laugh covering his retreat, the Duke of Ravenswood did precisely what Eleanor Beaumont would do an hour later. He found the tall glass door at the back of the ballroom, and he walked out of it, into the dark, alone, to breathe. He had been standing in the garden a long while, long enough for the noise of the ball to become a distant golden murmur, long enough for the boy of 19 to begin, in the quiet, to come, when he heard quick footsteps on the gravel and turned, and a young woman ran directly into his chest. You have seen what followed. You have heard her take him for a servant. You have heard her gloriously, magnificently, with no notion on this earth of what she was doing, order the Duke of Ravenswood to make himself useful and be quick about it. And you have heard his first reply to her, come dry out of the dark, that he was accustomed to disappointing expectations, and did it reliably well. Now let me give you the rest, because the rest is where the spark was struck. Ellie, hearing that dry answer, peered at him in the dim light, and a little of her flustered temper gave way to a frown. You speak, she said slowly, very strangely for a footman. Do I? You do. A footman would have said at once, my lady, and gone. You have said something almost epigrammatic, and not moved an inch. She tilted her head. The frown deepened. And then, being Ellie, being clever, being utterly without the deference that a wiser woman would have summoned, she did not retreat into apology. She advanced. You are not a footman at all, are you? You are one of the guests. Hiding, out here in the dark, away from all the light and the people, brooding at the hedges. A note that was almost, laughter came into her voice. Heavens! Are you the family melancholic? Has every great house got one? Do they keep you out here and bring you in for funerals? And the Duke of Ravenswood, who had been spoken to that evening by perhaps 40 people, every one of whom had weighed each word for its effect upon him, every one of whom had wanted something, every one of whom had been afraid. The Duke of Ravenswood discovered that he was, with no warning whatsoever, about to laugh. He did not laugh. But it was a near thing, and the nearness of it astonished him. You are remarkably free, he said, with your opinions, for a young woman alone in a dark garden with a strange man. I am remarkably free with my opinions everywhere, said Ellie. It is considered one of my chief faults. But you need not be alarmed on the point of the dark garden. I assure you I had no notion you would be in it, and I shall remove myself directly, and we may both go back to being miserable in private, which is so much more comfortable than being miserable in company. She paused. The moon, thin as it was, found her face for a moment, and the Duke of Ravenswood saw the freckles across her nose, and the clear hazel eyes, and the way the corner of her mouth would not quite stay, solemn. "Though I will say," she added, "that you are uncommonly bad at brooding. A truly accomplished brooder would not have answered me back. He would have gazed tragically into the middle distance and let me feel foolish. You have let me feel foolish, certainly. But you have done it by being almost amusing, which rather spoils the effect." There was a silence in the dark garden, and then Alexander of Ravenswood said something he had not planned to say. Something that came up from the carefully packed away place without asking his permission first. "What were you running from?" It was not a polite question. It was not a question one stranger asked another. And Ellie, who could have turned it aside with any one of a dozen pretty nothings, looked at the dark shape of this difficult, dry, unbroadable man, and found, to her own considerable surprise, that she did not want to. "A culvert," she said. "A great many culverts, in point of fact, and the gentleman who is so proud of them. And," here her voice changed, just slightly, just enough for an attentive listener to catch it, "and an evening I would rather not be having, in a life I would rather not be living, though I shall of course go back inside in a moment and have the one and live the other, because that is what is done." She stopped. She seemed faintly amazed at herself. "I cannot think why I told you that." "Because I am a stranger in a garden," said Alexander, "and you will never see me again, and that makes a confessional of almost anywhere. It is the same reason I asked." He was quiet a moment. "I was running from a ballroom in which 600 people wish something from me, and a grandmother who wishes the largest thing of all, and the particular noise a room makes when it has decided in advance who you are. And who has it decided you are?" "A cold man," he said, "in want of a quiet wife." "And are you?" "I am a man," said the Duke of Ravenswood, "standing in a garden, being interrogated by a person who has not told me her name, and who began our acquaintance by mistaking me for the help." And Ellie Beaumont laughed. It was not the small social laugh. It was the real one, the one that did the thing to a room, and it rang out, bright and unguarded, into the dark garden. And Alexander of Ravenswood stood and listened to it and felt something shift in his chest that he had thought packed away too deep and too carefully ever to be shifted again. She was still smiling when she dropped him a curtsy, a proper one, but with mischief running all through it, and said, "Lady Eleanor Beaumont, sir, and I am sorry about the lemonade, and I find I am not in the least sorry about the rest. I hope your grandmother does not get her largest wish too easily. A man who broods as badly as you do deserves a wife who will at least make the brooding interesting." And she turned, light-footed, to go back to her culverts and her duty. "You have still not asked," he said, "who I am." She paused, half-turned, the ball's distant gold light on the edge of her. "No," Ellie agreed. "I find I would rather not know. If you are nobody in particular, then I have had a delightful and improper conversation with a stranger, and may keep it. And if you are somebody very grand, the mischief again, the unkillable mischief, then I have just been unforgivably rude to him, and I would so much prefer to enjoy my supper first. Good night, sir. Do try to brood more convincingly. You have real natural disadvantages, but I believe with practice you might overcome them." And she was gone, back through the glass door, into the light. The Duke of Ravenswood stood alone in the garden for a long moment after she had gone. The boy of 19 did not come. For the first time in longer than Alexander could easily remember, the careful stillness he held himself in was not holding back grief. It was holding back something else entirely. Something warmer and far more dangerous, and the Duke of Ravenswood, war hero, cold man, most eligible bachelor in England, found that he was standing in the dark with one hand pressed flat against his own chest, as though he had been struck there, and was smiling at a hedge. If this were a simpler story, the Duke would have gone back inside, found out who Lady Eleanor Beaumont was, danced with her twice before the candles guttered, and been engaged to her by midsummer. But it is not a simpler story, and the world Ellie and Alexander lived in did not permit simple things. And so I must now tell you about the walls, because there were walls between them, high ones, and the highest of all was the one inside Alexander himself. He went back into the ballroom that night, and he did not seek her out. Understand that this was not indifference. It was the precise opposite of indifference, and that was the trouble. Alexander of Ravenswood had spent years building a still, grey, defended life, and he had built it for a reason. And the reason was that he did not believe himself to be a man who could safely be given anything to lose. He had lost the boy of 19. He had lost others. He had stood at Waterloo and learned, in his bones, in a way that no drawing room could ever unteach him, that the people you let yourself love can be taken from you between one breath and the next, with no warning and no mercy and no appeal. And a sensible man, a man who has learned that lesson, does not go looking for new things to lose. So when his grandmother asked him, on the cold ride home, whether any young lady had taken his interest, the Duke of Ravenswood looked out of the carriage window into the dark and said, "No." It was the first lie he had told her in 9 years. She knew it for a lie at once. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenswood had not survived 70 years at the summit of that world by being deceived by her own grandson. And she said nothing, and she folded her hands on the silver head of her cane, and she began, quite quietly, behind her sharp pale eyes, to plan. For the Dowager wanted her grandson married, and married soon. But I would do her a disservice if I let you think it was a cold ambition. She was sharp, and she was formidable, and she had ruled that family with a will of iron for half a century. But she had also sat by Alexander's bed, in the bad months after he came home from the war, and she had heard, through the door, the sounds a man makes in his sleep when the war will not stay in its box, and she had said nothing of it to a living soul. She did not want him to marry a fortune. She did not, truly, even want him to marry a bloodline. The Dowager Duchess wanted, with the whole of her hard old heart, for somebody, anybody, to reach the grandson she loved before the stillness he had wrapped himself in finished the slow work of turning into stone. She simply had not, until now, had the smallest hope that such a person existed. She had begun, on that carriage ride, to suspect that her grandson had just met them, and she meant to find out who. That was one wall, Alexander's own fear, and his grandmother's loving, dangerous determination to breach it. But there was another, and it ran the other way, and it was built of something the age cared about, even more than fortune. It was built of reputation. A duke might marry where he pleased. That was nearly true. But a duchess could not have a past. A duchess must be above the smallest breath of question. Pure, the word the gossips used, pure as new snow, because the duchess of a house like Ravenswood was not a woman, in the eyes of that world. She was a monument, and a monument with a crack in it is worse than no monument at all. And Lady Eleanor Beaumont, however clever, however brave, however much she had made a duke smile at a hedge, Lady Eleanor Beaumont came trailing cracks. A father dead in disgrace and debt, a family sunk out of its proper sphere. No fortune, no settlement, nothing to bring to a marriage but herself. The Ton had already, quietly, filed her under the heading it kept for such young women. Not quite. And the Ton's filing, once done, was very hard to undo. So there were the walls. And you must hold them in your mind through everything that follows, because Ellie and Alexander were going to spend the rest of this story being driven against them. His fear, his grandmother's plans, the pitiless arithmetic of reputation, and, prowling along the base of all of it, looking for a way in, a man in a midnight blue coat who had taken one cool inventory of a dowerless girl's turned gown and decided that her desperation made her exactly what he required. For the Duke of Ravenswood was not the only man at the Richmond ball who had taken note of Lady Eleanor Beaumont, and the other man was not going to be deterred by walls. The other man, as you are about to see, was going to use them. The pursuit. The morning after the Richmond ball, a great quantity of hothouse roses arrived at the narrow rented house of the Beaumonts. They were beautiful, and they were expensive, extravagantly, almost aggressively expensive. 24 perfect blooms out of season, the sort of gift that is less a compliment than a statement of accounts. And the card tucked among them bore the name of Viscount Harrington. Margaret was enchanted. Margaret buried her face in the roses and declared the Viscount the most romantic creature in London, and demanded to know why Ellie was not dancing about the room. The Viscountess, summoned from her sick room by the unusual excitement, fingered a velvet petal and looked at her clever elder daughter with a sudden, fragile, terrible hope rising in her tired eyes. And that look, that hope on her mother's face, did more to frighten Ellie than all the roses in England. And Ellie herself stood in the cramped little parlour amid the heavy sweet scent of all those flowers, and felt, once again and stronger than before, the cold thread pull tight beneath her ribs. This was the beginning of the pursuit. And I want to be careful telling you of it, to tell it truly, because Viscount Harrington did nothing in those first weeks of the season that any drawing room in London could have pointed to and called wrong. That was his great skill. He was always correct. He called at the correct hour and stayed the correct length of time. He sent flowers and books, well-chosen books too, for he had taken the trouble to learn that Lady Eleanor read, and there is something colder than I can easily express in a man who studies a woman's mind only the better to bait his hook with it. He secured her hand for 2 dances at every ball, and not the scandalous 3. He was attentive to the Viscountess's health, and gracious to the silly aunt, and charming, endlessly charming, to Margaret. To the watching world, Viscount Harrington was a wealthy and unexceptionable man, paying a serious and honourable address to a young woman who would have been a fool to refuse him. But Ellie was not the watching world. Ellie was the woman inside the courtship, and from inside it she felt what the watchers could not see. She felt how the Viscount's attentions arrived always with a faint, deliberate weight, how each gift, each call, each public dance was placed like a stone upon a wall, building, week by week, a structure of expectation that it would soon be impossible, without open scandal, to walk out of. She felt how he spoke to her always as though the matter were already settled between them, as though her consent were a formality that the calendar had simply not yet reached. And she felt, most of all, the thing he did with her family. For Harrington courted the Viscountess quite as assiduously as he courted Ellie, sat with the ailing mother, and spoke gently of physicians, and quiet futures, and the lifting of cares, until the poor woman's hopeful eyes followed him about the room, until Margaret chattered of him at every meal, until Ellie understood, with a sinking and helpless clarity, that the Viscount was not trying to win her at all. He was trying to surround her. He was making it so that to refuse him would be to refuse her mother's peace and her sister's future and the rescue of everyone she loved, so that her own reluctance would come to feel like selfishness, like cruelty, like a clever, ungrateful girl's vanity set against the survival of her family. He was building her a cage, and he was building it with great skill out of her own love for the people in that house. She said as much to Charlotte, walking in the park, in a low voice, on a grey afternoon. And Charlotte, who missed nothing, did not tell her she was imagining it. "I made some inquiries," Charlotte said, "after the ball. You asked me what I knew of him, and I found I did not like how little it was, so I asked." She was quiet for a few steps. "Ellie, I cannot give you a fact. He has been very careful that there should be a fact. But I will give you this. There was a family." The Carstairs, You will not know them. They are out of town now and like to stay so. And 3 years ago they were comfortable, and now they are not. And Harrington's name moves through the story of how that came to be like a draught through a house. You cannot see the draught. You can only feel the cold of it and see the candles lean. She stopped and took Ellie's hands and looked very directly at her. I do not know what he is, but I know that careful men are careful for a reason, and I am asking you, as the person who loves you most in the world after your own mother, do not let them hurry you, whatever it costs. Do not let yourself be hurried. It was good counsel. It was the best counsel anyone gave Ellie in the whole of that long season. But counsel, however good, does not pay a doctor. And over those same weeks, the cracked glass of the Beaumont finances ran lower, and a particular creditor grew a particular degree less patient, and the Viscountess had a bad week, and the physician came 3 times instead of 2. And Ellie sat up late over the account book with her single candle, and did her grim arithmetic, and saw the figure at the bottom of the column, and understood that the time her family had left was now to be measured not in years, but in months. And against that figure at the bottom of the column, Viscount Harrington's wealth stood like a closed and well-stocked door. This was the trap, and it was a true one, and there was no clever way through it, and Ellie was clever enough to know there was not. She could feel the cold of the draught exactly as Charlotte said. But she could also feel the cold of the empty grate when there was no coal, and the cold was real, and her mother was truly ill, and Margaret was truly 19 with truly nothing, and a young woman cannot warm the people she loves by the light of her own bad feeling about a man. And the Duke of Ravenswood, where, you are asking, quite rightly, was the Duke through all these grey weeks of the closing trap? He was watching. That is the answer, and it is not a comfortable one. The Duke of Ravenswood, who had resolved so firmly to seek nothing and risk nothing and want nothing, found that his resolution had developed a single specific maddening flaw, and the flaw was named Eleanor Beaumont. He did not call at the narrow house. He did not send roses. He did nothing, told himself he would do nothing. And yet, at ball after ball, rout after rout, the Duke of Ravenswood found himself standing a little apart, grey-eyed and silent and apparently bored, and watching, across the candlelit rooms, the slow and skilful courtship of a dowerless girl by a man in a midnight coat. He saw what the room did not. Alexander had spent years learning to read a battlefield, to see, in the small movements of distant men, the shape of the danger before it broke, and he watched Harrington work, and what he saw made the old cold stillness settle over him in a new and different way. He saw the placing of the stones. He saw the cage going up. He saw, one evening, the particular practiced gentleness with which Harrington bent over the chair of the invalid Viscountess, and Alexander of Ravenswood, watching from across the room, felt his own gloved hand close slowly into a fist at his side, and did not for a moment recognize the thing rising in his chest, because it had been so long since he had felt strongly enough about anything to feel it. It was not jealousy, or it was not only jealousy. It was something older and harder and far more characteristic of the man. It was the cold fury of a soldier who has seen, from the high ground, an ambush being laid for people who cannot see it themselves. He knew something about Harrington. I will tell you plainly that he did, for it is no secret from you, though it was very much a secret from Ellie. The Duke of Ravenswood and Viscount Harrington shared a history, a dark one, with its roots in the war, and Alexander had reasons of his own, old and personal reasons, to believe the man in the midnight coat was rotten clean through. But it was knowledge he could not use. It was knowledge tangled up with his own family's most guarded griefs, knowledge he could not lay before a drawing-room, or a magistrate, or a clever frightened girl, without unspooling things he had. spent years and his whole strength keeping wound tight. And so the Duke of Ravenswood was left with only one card he could bring himself to play. The wrong one, the one a proud and clever woman could only take as an insult. He decided, God help him, to help her with money. Whispers. It happened at the Thornbury garden party, and a garden, you will have noticed, is where the hinges of this story always seem to turn. The Thornbury garden party was one of the great fixtures of the season, held on a vast green slope above the river, with marquees and musicians and the whole of fashionable London strolling the lawns under a kind, bright, treacherous June sun. Ellie went because one did not refuse the Thornburys. Harrington went because Ellie went, and the Duke of Ravenswood went because his grandmother had once again applied her cane to the matter. Though the dowager, watching her grandson's grey eyes track a certain figure across the lawn, within 2 minutes of their arrival, had begun to suspect that her cane was no longer the chief reason her grandson appeared anywhere at all. For a clever woman, even a hunted one, a garden party offers a particular small mercy. Room. Room to move, room to drift, room to lose, for a quarter of an hour, the man at one's elbow. And Ellie, who had been at Harrington's elbow, or in his eye-line for the better part of a fortnight, took her quarter of an hour. She slipped away down a path, between tall flowering hedges, toward the quieter green at the garden's edge, simply to be, for a few breaths, a person and not a prize. She was not the only guest who had wanted air. She came round the turn of the hedge, and there, on a stone bench alone, was the Duke of Ravenswood. And the recognition went through them both at once, that particular jolt, and for a moment neither of them said the wise thing, which would have been a cool word and a parting. Lady Eleanor. He had risen. I am told, he said, with the gravity of a man approaching a subject through the only door he can find, that you never asked that night in the garden who I was. I find I have been waiting some weeks for the satisfaction of telling you, and that no one has been so obliging as to let me. I know who you are now, said Ellie. The corner of her mouth was doing its disobedient thing. All of London made very sure I should know, the moment I came back inside. The cold duke, the brooding statue. I had been unforgivably rude to a duke, exactly as I feared, and I have had several weeks to be ashamed of it. You have not been ashamed of it for one moment. No, Ellie admitted. Not for one. It was the only honest conversation I had had in a year. And there it was again. That thing between them. That quick, warm, dangerous current, leaping the gap as though the weeks had never passed. They talked. On a stone bench at the green edge of the Thornbury Gardens, screened by the tall hedges, Ellie and Alexander talked the way they had talked in the dark. Too truly, too easily. The Duke who confided in no one and the lady who carried her family alone, each of them startled all over again by how little armour they seemed able to keep on in the other's company. He spoke of a book, she answered, with a line of French poetry, and then, colouring, with her own English carrying of it, and saw his grey eyes change. She made him laugh. Actually laugh, aloud, a sound that turned a passing gardener's head, and Alexander of Ravenswood thought, with a clarity that frightened him, I could listen to that for the rest of my life. They were not touching, they were not doing one single thing that an honest witness could have called wrong. They had simply, for 20 unguarded minutes, forgotten the walls. But the walls had not forgotten them. There is a sound a garden party makes when it discovers something, and Ellie heard it before she saw the cause. A small change in the murmur from beyond the hedge, a quickening, a knot of voices, pulling tight. 2 ladies had come round the turn of the path. They had seen what was on the stone bench. A marriageable young woman of damaged fortune and no chaperone, alone, screened by hedges, deep in low and laughing conversation with the unmarried Duke of Ravenswood. The ladies had looked. The ladies had exchanged a single glance. And the ladies had withdrawn, already talking, and the murmur had begun to move across the Thornbury. lawns the way fire moves across a dry field. By the time Ellie understood what had happened, it had already happened. That is the particular cruelty of reputation in that world. It is not lost in a moment you can see coming and brace for. It is lost behind your back, in other rooms, in other people's mouths, and you only learn of it afterward, by the new way the world has arranged its face to look at you. The story that ran through the season over the following days was not even, strictly, a lie. That was the worst of it. No one said Ellie had done anything. They did not need to. They said only the facts. Alone, the Duke, the hedges, no chaperone, 20 minutes, laughing. And they let the facts do the work. Because in that world, a fact set down in a certain tone is more deadly than any lie. The dowerless Beaumont girl, the whisper went, was throwing herself at Ravenswood. And this version was crueler, and Ellie came to suspect, later, exactly whose careful hand had given it its push. The dowerless Beaumont girl was a schemer, a fortune hunter trading on her father's old name, and the Duke would be wise, and his formidable grandmother wiser, to have a care. For here is what I have not yet told you, and what Ellie did not learn for a long while. Viscount Harrington had been at the Thornbury party. Viscount Harrington had seen her slip away down the path, and Viscount Harrington, far from being wounded that the woman he courted had been found alone with another man, had felt, behind his smooth, correct, untroubled face, a flush of something close to pleasure. Because a young woman whose reputation has just been cracked is a young woman with fewer doors left open to her. A whisper against Ellie did not drive Harrington off. A whisper against Ellie drew the cage one notch tighter. And so the whisper, as it crossed the lawns, found a quiet friend in the midnight blue coat, who did not start it. Harrington was far too careful ever to start a thing, but who, here and there, in the right ear, with the gravest show of reluctance and concern, helped it along. Ellie went home from the Thornbury party, with her chin up and her face calm and her heart cold with dread. She had felt the trap, and resolved to be careful, and been careful. And the world had cracked her good name anyway, not for a sin, but for 20 honest minutes of being, briefly, happy. And the Duke of Ravenswood went home from the Thornbury party in a black and terrible silence, because he had seen the two ladies round the hedge. He had seen the murmur start, and he had understood, with the swift battlefield clarity that never failed him and never comforted him, exactly what his 20 selfish minutes had just cost a woman who could not afford to pay. He had brought her into the open. He had let himself forget the walls, and she was the one who would bleed for it. And the Duke of Ravenswood, who did not believe himself safe to be given anything to lose, sat alone that night in his great dark house, and resolved that he would make it right, that he would do, at last, the one thing his power could straightforwardly do. It was the worst decision he made in the whole of this story, and he made it, as we so often make our worst decisions, entirely out of the wish to do good. Pride he came to the narrow house himself. That was the measure of how badly he had judged it. The Duke of Ravenswood, who called nowhere, came in person, on a wet grey morning, and the arrival of his plain black carriage in that unfashionable street set every curtain on it twitching. The Viscountess was beside herself. A duke, an actual duke, in the cramped parlour, and her clever difficult Ellie the cause of it. Margaret was sent flying for the good tea that was kept for emergencies, and Ellie came down the stairs slowly, her hand cold on the rail because she had no notion why he had come, and some wise and frightened part of her did not want to find out. He had the grace, at least, to ask to speak with her plainly. The Viscountess, scandalized and delighted in equal measure, allowed it, left the parlour door an inch ajar, as honour required, and herself withdrew just out of sight. And so Ellie and Alexander stood facing each other across that small, shabby, genteel room, with its turned curtains and its careful fire, and for a moment the Duke of Ravenswood, who had faced Cannon, found that he did not know how to begin. Lady Eleanor, he began wrongly. He knew, even as the words left him, that he was beginning wrongly, and he could not find the other way. What occurred at the Thornbury party, the talk that has followed it, that was my doing. I was careless of your situation in a manner I had no right to be, and you are suffering a consequence that should, in any just arrangement of the world, fall upon me alone. I have come to set it right. You cannot set it right, Your Grace. Ellie's voice was quiet and steady. A whisper cannot be called back. You of all people must know that. It is kind of you to wish it, but I do not propose to call back the whisper. He said it too quickly and too stiffly, the words coming out in the flat, controlled, defended tone that the world had so long mistaken for coldness. I propose to render it powerless. The whisper has force only because your family's circumstances make you vulnerable to it. Remove the circumstances, and the whisper is merely noise. He drew breath. He had rehearsed this. She could hear that he had rehearsed it, and the rehearsal made it worse. I am aware, Lady Eleanor, of the difficulties under which this household labours, the debts your father left, your mother's health, your sister's want of a settlement. These are matters that money, a quantity of money entirely unremarkable to me, would simply dissolve. I wish to make such a settlement upon your family, discreetly, with no condition attached to it, and no expectation, and no claim of any kind upon yourself. I wish only to know that the consequence of my carelessness has been undone, and that you and those you love are placed beyond the reach of— Stop. It was a single word, and it was very quiet, and it stopped the Duke of Ravenswood exactly as though she had laid a hand flat against his chest. Ellie had gone pale, and then she had gone the opposite of pale, and she stood very straight in the middle of the small turned and mended room, and when she spoke again her voice shook, not with weakness, and he understood that at once. It shook the way a drawn bowstring shakes. You wish to give me money, she said. You have looked at this house, and at my mother's medicine, and at my sister, and at my dead father's debts, and you have decided that we are a problem, a piece of untidiness, that a gentleman of your fortune might smooth flat with the stroke of a pen, the way he might pay to have a ditch filled in. And you have come here in your own carriage to be kind to us. She drew a breath that caught. Your Grace, I am going to tell you something, and I beg you to truly hear it, because I do not think anyone in your life has said it to you in a great many years. There are things that cannot be received as gifts without ceasing, in the receiving, to be anything a person can live beside. My pride is not a vanity. It is very nearly the only possession your world has not yet stripped from me. I count this house. I turn these gowns. I sit up over these accounts until my candle gutters, and I keep this family afloat with my own 2 hands and my own wits, and it is hard, and it is frightening, and it is mine. It is the one thing I have done, and you would buy it from me. You would hand me your unremarkable quantity of money, and in the same motion take from me the only thing I have left to be proud of, and you would call that setting it right. Eleanor, it was the first time he had used her name without the title, and neither of them noticed it then, though both of them remembered it afterward. I meant only, I know what you meant. And here, terribly, her voice gentled, and the gentleness was worse than anger. That is the hardest part of it. You meant it well. You are not a cold man, Your Grace, whatever London says of you. I knew that in the first 5 minutes, in the dark, before I knew anything else. You meant it as kindness. But kindness that is not also respect is only a softer kind of contempt. You did not come here today to ask me anything. You did not come to consult me, or to stand beside me, or to ask how a clever woman who has kept her family alive for 3 years might wish to be helped. You came to manage me. You looked at my life and you saw a problem to be solved with the one tool great men are never taught to set down. And I would rather. Her chin came up, and her hazel eyes were bright and unbroken, and she finished it clearly. I would rather sink, Your Grace, with this family in my own arms, than be salvaged, like cargo, by a man who mistook my drowning for an untidiness. The parlour was very quiet. The careful little fire ticked in the grate. Beyond the inch of open door, the Viscountess had stopped pretending to do anything at all, and the Duke of Ravenswood stood and looked at Lady Eleanor Beaumont. And something happened in his face, something the cold mask was not built to contain. Because he had come into that room, believing himself the strong one, the one with the means, the rescuer. And he understood now, fully in the space of a held breath, that he had walked in carrying a sword into a conversation that had needed open hands, and that the woman in the turned gown across the shabby room had more dignity in her drawn bowstring anger than he had managed to keep through 3 years of dukedom, and a whole war. He did not argue. That, at least. And Ellie noted it, and it mattered, later, more than she could then have guessed. He did not argue, or bluster, or reach for his rank. He inclined his head, once slowly, the way a man concedes a field. "I have insulted you," said the Duke of Ravenswood, low. "I came to undo a wrong, and I have done you a greater one, and the worst of it is that you are entirely right about the cause. I have forgotten how to offer a thing without commanding it. I will not trouble you with this again." He moved to the door, and there he paused, and turned. And for one moment the mask was wholly gone, and she saw the man under it, grey-eyed and unguarded and genuinely undone. "But you are wrong, Lady Eleanor, on the single point that you would sink unmissed. Whatever you decide, and whomever you decide it with, you should not be hurried." It was almost word for word what Charlotte had said, and Ellie felt the strange chime of it. Good night. And he was gone, out into the wet grey street, and the plain black carriage pulled away, and the curtains of that unfashionable road twitched it out of sight. Ellie stood alone in the parlour. Her mother was saying something from the hall, something fluttering and reproachful, something that had the words Duke and Fortune and good heavens, Eleanor in it. And Ellie did not hear it. She was looking at the place where he had stood, and she was pressing one hand hard against the front of her own gown, exactly as he had pressed his against his chest in a dark garden some weeks before, and she did not yet have a name for what she was feeling, and that was as well because she did not have time to feel it. For her mother, fretful and overwrought by the morning's drama, had taken a turn, and must be got back upstairs and settled. And the doctor must, after all, be sent for. And the doctor must, after all, be paid. And so Lady Eleanor Beaumont put the Duke of Ravenswood out of her mind by main force, and squared her shoulders, and went to do the next thing and the next, because that is what is done. It was late that evening, the house dark, her mother asleep at last, the dreadful day finally folding itself shut, that Ellie did the small ordinary thing that ends our story's first part, and changes everything that is to come. The letter the doctor's fee had to be found. That was the plain root of it. The morning's upset had cost an unplanned visit, and the unplanned visit had to be paid. And Ellie, sitting alone at the worn writing desk in the late quiet of the house, the single candle burning, the account book open and offering her no comfort at all, knew of only one place left in that narrow house where something of value might yet be hiding. Her father's desk. It was a tall, old writing desk of dark wood, the one fine thing the creditors had somehow overlooked or disdained, and it had stood untouched in the corner of the back room. Since the Viscount died, Ellie had never been able to make herself open it. To open it was to go into the small, dark space her father had left behind him, and she had not, in 3 years, felt strong enough. But the doctor must be paid, and there had used to be, she half remembered, a few things in its drawers, a seal, a silver penknife, oddments, that a discreet shop would give coin for. And so, Very late, by the light of one candle, Ellie Beaumont carried her courage across the dark room and opened her dead father's desk at last. It smelled of him. That was the first blow, and she had not braced for it. The faint ghost of pipe smoke and old paper, 3 years gone and still there. And she had to sit a moment with her hand flat on the desk's surface and simply breathe. Then she did the work. She found the seal and the penknife and a snuff box not worth much, and she set them aside for the morning. And then, because she was thorough, because she had taught herself over 3 hard years to be thorough, she felt right to the back of the deepest drawer to be certain it was empty. It was not empty. At the very back, flat against the wood, her fingers found a single folded paper. She drew it out. She opened it in the candlelight, expecting an old receipt, a tradesman's bill, the dry leavings of a dead man's business. It was a letter in her father's hand, and it was not finished. It had no date she could be sure of, though the ink had the brown of some years. It began without any greeting at all. It was a draft, she understood, a thing written to be copied fair and never copied. And the hand was her father's, familiar one, but unsteady in places, hurried, the hand of a man writing fast and low and perhaps afraid. And Lady Eleanor Beaumont sat alone in the dark at her dead father's desk, and read the words her father had written and hidden and never sent. And the candle flame stood very still, and the cold thread that had pulled tight beneath her ribs at the sight of a midnight coat drew now so tight that she could scarcely breathe around it. I will not give you the whole of the letter tonight. It is not mine to give you all at once. It belongs to the parts of this story still to come, and you will have every line of it before we are done. But I will give you the heart of it, the few sentences that Ellie read 3 times over in the silence of that dark house, her hand beginning, slowly, to shake. Her father had written that he was a fool and a sinner and the author of his family's ruin, and all of that she had known. But then her father had written this. He had written that in these last months he had come, too late, to see the shape of the thing entire, that the games into which he had been drawn had not been the chance misfortunes of an unlucky man, that the same few faces had sat always at those tables, that the debts, when they came due, had a way of gathering always into the same 2 or 3 hands, that a man had been at his elbow through all of it, a smiling man, a friend, guiding him, steadying him, lending to him, leading him, with great patience and great skill, step by careful step toward the precipice. And her father had written, in a line that Ellie read a 4th time, and a 5th, with the whole dark house silent around her. I begin to believe I was never an unlucky man at all. I begin to believe I was a hunted one, and that the hunt was long and patient and is not even now concluded. The letter broke off there, mid-thought. The pen had simply stopped, and whatever her father had meant to write next, the name of the smiling man, the proof of the hunt, the warning he had, perhaps meant this letter to be. None of it was ever set down, or none of it survived. There was only that, and then the white silence of the unwritten page, and the small brown line where the ink had dried unfinished 3 years before. Ellie sat for a very long time without moving. Her father's debts, the catastrophe that had killed him, and toppled the house of Beaumont, and sent her into a glittering ballroom to be sold to save the people she loved. Her father's debts had not been simply her father's weakness and her father's bad luck. Someone had built them. Someone had sat at her father's elbow, year upon year, wearing the face of a friend, and patiently, deliberately, for a purpose she could not yet begin to see, hunted a charming weak man and his whole innocent family to the edge of the cliff and over it. The hunt was long and patient and is not, even now, concluded. Not concluded. Her father had written those words 3 years ago, and 3 years ago her father had died of it. And Ellie Beaumont sat alone in the dark with the letter in her shaking hand and felt, with a terrible cold certainty, the truth her father had not lived to write. If the hunt was not concluded when he wrote those words, then it had a quarry still. The Viscount was dead. The Viscount was beyond any hunter's reach. But the Viscount had left a widow and 2 daughters, and a name. And one of those daughters was at that very moment being courted, surrounded, hurried, caged by a smiling and patient man, the candle guttered. And in the dark of that narrow, rented house, Lady Eleanor Beaumont understood that her family's ruin was not finished, and not an accident, and that the worst of this story had not yet even begun. And there, my dear listeners, is where I must leave the first part of our tale, with a letter in a shaking hand, and a hunt not yet concluded, and a clever, frightened, magnificent young woman alone, in the dark beginning at last, to understand the true shape of the danger she stands in. In the part that follows, the doors of Ravenswood Park will open. The whole company of our story will be gathered under one great roof for a summer house party. Ellie and her family, the formidable dowager and her guarded grandson, the watchful Charlotte, the charming Sebastian Vale, and the smiling man in the midnight coat. And a house party, as you will see, is a very dangerous place to gather people who are keeping secrets from one another. There will be a library, and a rainstorm, and a bolting horse, and a moment in a moonlit orangery that comes within one breath of changing everything. Ellie will go looking for the truth about her father, and she will find a thread of it where she least expects. And what she learns will bind her fate and the Duke's together far more tightly, and far more perilously, than either of them yet dreams. And the longer Alexander of Ravenswood stays near her, the harder it becomes for him to keep the door shut on the one thing he most fears. That he has, against all his will and all his wisdom, been given something to lose. The rose, you will remember, is the flower of this story, and in the part to come you will begin to learn why, and what, exactly, has been growing all this while in its shadow. Stay close, the fire is still warm, and the tale is far from told.